I guarantee you that every organized military in every country on this planet has contingency plans for, not just for climate change in particular or in general, but pandemics, sea level rise, big storms, and all these sorts of things. And nobody thinks that it is a waste of money for military people to anticipate problems so that they never happen. Okay, one of the reasons countries like China, the United States, and Russia spend so much money trying to anticipate potential conflicts between them is based on the assumption that all those countries are all doing the same thing and that they're all going to come to the same conclusion that this would not be good for anybody, so then it doesn't happen. So nobody thinks that it's a waste of money to plan for wars that we never have to fight. But imagine what the reaction would be if some military leader said, oh, we never saw that coming. We never saw that as a possibility. I mean, that person would be dead in 20 minutes. So, you know, the military people are extremely pragmatic. And it is the U.S. military is the only organization of the United States government right now that actually takes climate change seriously. And this is a good thing and a bad thing, because in the American system of government, if there is a major pandemic, even if the military has a plan, they cannot simply implement the plan, because there's strong civilian control of the military. And so right now, if there was a major pandemic in the United States, the Pentagon would have to ask Donald Trump for permission to do something about it. So, what do? Well, there's an election in November. You know, the American people can decide to not vote stupid this time. I mean, it's a very strange thing, because a lot of this is all about personal responsibility. You know, in the United States, 45% of the reason we have Donald Trump is because 45% of American voters did not vote because they have no confidence in the system at all anymore. I mean, that's a terrible thing. 45% of Americans have no confidence in the American form of government because they looked at the two candidates and said, they're both losers. Yeah, one of them's psychotic, but they're both losers. Neither one of them is particularly good. So, well, you know, if you vote stupid, you get stupid. So that's, you know, that's one of the things I keep doing, like with my family, for example, who think Donald Trump was the best thing that ever happened because, you know, at least he's not black. I keep telling them that, you know, Trump is a symptom of something. Trump's not a cause of any of this. Trump's a symptom of something else, because the United States is not the only participatory democracy where voting has decreased significantly over the last 30 years. The only countries where voting has not decreased are countries where voting is mandatory by law, where you have to pay a fine if you don't vote. But every country that has voluntary voting, every democratic representative democracy that has voluntary voting over the last 30 years, including Canada, has seen this happen. People are beginning to worry that democratic governments are not capable of responding rapidly enough and effectively enough to things like climate change. On the other hand, they don't know what the alternative would be. So, you know, so I'm not saying we're all dead, but I'm saying that if we don't start doing something right now, we will be. And the only good news in this is that we actually, the scientific community as a whole, actually has a pretty good idea of what we could do. But there's no place on this planet where scientists can enact social programs by themselves. So every scientist on this planet needs policymaker, politician, somebody, government official, to implement the plan.
I have a question after just such a long discussion, by the way. Thank you very much for your so pathetic presentation about our future, which probably ruined our day. Nevertheless, what I wanted to stress, actually, your presentation were more philosophical, I guess so, and analytical. Would I suggest that your book has much more scientific data and facts? Because everything should be based on facts. Maybe hundreds of facts are proving just climate changes and proving also appearance of new epidemics globally. So because thinking globally, we need to think locally. At least thinking about our nature in a city, would we say that new possible diseases come into every city, possibility of that have been proved on some cases, like in Zika virus or other viruses, which change their hosts. For example, this paper, this paper, this paper. Maybe these papers have been mentioned in your book as well. Are any or many facts about such changes of specialization for parasites and for pathogens as well? How many of them? Just few or dozens or hundreds?
Well, we were restricted in our book. The editors told us to restrict our bibliography to less than 1,500 references out of about 12,000 that we have. The reality is we in fact don't know of any publications that have not found this pattern.
I have a question that leads to the previous one. We have the primates and humans in most cases can cohabitate. Humans go into jungles, they leave their trash there, they leave their stuff there, everything there. Should we have primates that will increase their parasites in time?
Oh yeah. A major, one of the major reservoirs of Zika in Brazil right now is spider monkeys, and human beings gave it to them. And one of the things that I was in Brazil, I was with Walter. I was in Brazil on a Ciências Sem Fronteiras fellowship in 2014, 15, and 16. In 2014, the Zika business began to blow up, and my colleague there, Walter Bieger, went to the Brazilian government and said, you have got to start monitoring the non-human primates because Zika is going to get into them, and then you'll never get rid of Zika. And they said, no, it's not, it's not going to get into, these things don't host switch, they have to wait till there's a genetic mutation, and it's not going to happen. And now, Zika's in the spider monkeys. There are the strain of yellow fever from the most recent outbreak in Minas Gerais state in Brazil. That's the strain of yellow fever that's showing up in the howler monkeys in Brazil now. So there's an enormous amount of things moving in both directions. And one of the things that we know empirically is that if you have a pathogen that's causing disease in one species of host, you can be certain that there's another species of host that is the reservoir of that pathogen. And we don't know about it because that host is not diseased, so we don't pay any attention to it. That's where finding them before they find us comes from. So part of the protocol is that we need to be really focusing on the interfaces between green spaces and urban spaces and agricultural and wildlands, because that's where, I guarantee you that there are a whole lot of pathogens that are being transmitted between wild boar and domestic pigs in this country. And and there are other things like borreliosis, Lyme disease, that's now, we now know there are 18 different species of Borrelia in Hungary alone. And each one has a different reservoir, and oftentimes the reservoir is something we never thought about. So you're right, and one of the things that's interesting in the history of parasitology, we have an enormous number of studies of parasites that get transmitted to really funny hosts in zoos. And we've always just dismissed those. Oh, you can't trust that. Of course, everybody's stressed and blah, blah, blah. But the reality is, all these zoo records give us an indication of who could be susceptible if the conditions were right.
Sasha.
Excuse me, but if there is a host species that has specimens do not have disease, is this not an example of coevolution?
No. It's an example of two species that are capable of living together. Okay, I mean, it's coevolution if you want to say that, you know, the entire biosphere is co-evolved. And, you know, I mean, that's kind of the view that James Lovelock likes to promote, the Gaia hypothesis and everything, where everybody's just getting along together really fine. But one of the things that's interesting, Roy Anderson and Robert May published a series of models in the late 1970s. So more than 40 years ago, they published a series of mathematical models that showed that there is no necessary connection between pathogenicity and the persistence of a pathogen in a host. So just because you're not causing disease doesn't mean you're going to be able to survive in that host for a long time. Even if you're highly pathogenic, you're not necessarily going to go extinct from that host. The issue of whether disease is being caused or not is an emergent property of something else. So, for example, if we, for example, with Ebola, right? The impression is that if you get Ebola, you die. And in some cases that's true, but in some cases it's only 20% of the people who get Ebola die. And that's because we quote unquote don't understand that because we haven't been studying the population genetics of Ebola. And it turns out that the different reservoir hosts of Ebola in different parts of Africa have different strains of Ebola. And those strains have differential degrees of impact on hosts like humans, where it can't persist. Ebola can't persist in humans for more than 6 weeks. But it could be that you could be having coevolutionary dynamics and pathogenicity. It could be that you could be having coevolutionary dynamics and nothing. But neither one of those is necessary. And that's one of the reasons why we have all these models about very tight coevolution, and almost, to speak to this gentleman's point, almost no published cases in which it's been documented experimentally. I mean, this is one of the weird things about the coevolutionary arms race. Everybody just says it's happening, but we actually have almost no experimental studies that document it.
Doesn't it mean that even if new parasites will spread, the economic results may not be so drastic?
Initially, that's true. I mean, that's a really good point. If you have pathogens, that's why I said before that the geographic distribution of a pathogen is not the geographic distribution of disease caused by that pathogen. So it's very common. There are undoubtedly pathogens in Ukraine now that are not causing disease now, but could, because they cause disease someplace else. And there are a complicated number of reasons why that might be or might not be. The issue is if pathogens moving into new hosts is more a matter of opportunity than capacity. So if we think that they always have greater capacity than they manifest, we have to be worried. So if something is, and this is, again, this is part of the protocol that Tatiana was asking me about. There are two kinds of things. If we go and we begin inventorying, say we want to do all the viruses in rodents in Ukraine, okay? Now, are we going to spend enormous amounts of time on every single virus that we find? No, of course not. We don't have the time and money to do that. So what is the triage? What do we focus on? We would focus on viruses that are known to cause disease someplace else, even if they haven't caused disease here yet. And that's good because now we know they're here. Okay? Or something that's very closely related to something that causes disease someplace else. So those are the two kinds of pathogens we want to focus in on. So the primary triage of pathogen inventories is phylogenetic analysis. You collect an enormous number of things, you look at them phylogenetically. If they are known pathogens, or if they're close relatives of known pathogens, then you spend more time on them. If they're not, you ignore them. Because most of the pathogens that are in your body right now are not causing you disease. Like everybody in this room has streptococcus in their throat. Nobody has a strep throat infection. But any of you might. As if you get stressed, if you get too tired, major professors causing you too many problems, the reviewers are nasty, you get all upset, then you could have a strep throat outbreak. Now, if you go to the doctor is more than likely going to treat a streptococcus infection as a drug deficiency. Oh, you have streptococcal infection, here, take streptomycin. Leave. Next. That's because doctors are not scientists. They're like automobile mechanics. They're just, all they're doing is trying to suppress the symptoms. Now I know this because my father was a doctor. And my father was the first president of a group of very radical American physicians called the Society for Clinical Ecology. It was the forerunner of environmental medicine. So my father was talking about environmental problems, environmental health problems in the 1950s. And his colleagues hated it because, you know, he would say, let me find out why this person keeps having a sore throat. Oh, it's because you're not getting enough sleep. Get more sleep, and then you never need to spend money on drugs anymore. You never need to spend money on the doctor anymore. Because the cause of the disease is your fatigue. It's not a deficiency of a drug. And so he taught me that most of what physicians are taught to do is suppress symptoms. And he taught me that physicians are always taught to be really conservative. Do no harm. Do no harm, right? Do no harm in an era of climate change means wait until there's an epidemic and then put on the spacesuits and go in and try to do something about it. But by that time, it's too late. And nobody understands where do no harm comes from. Nobody understands that today's modern medicine has a philosophical basis that goes back to a legal code that said if you're a doctor and you treat someone for an eye infection and they lose the sight of that eye, we're going to take your eye out. That's called an eye for an eye. If you treat someone for a tooth infection and they lose that tooth, your tooth is pulled out. That's called a tooth for a tooth. An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. It's got nothing to do with religion. It's got to do with making medical practitioners really conservative about what they do to their patients. That was 3,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, and we still do this. We still go, oh, I don't know, we better wait and see what happens here. And then, when the disease blows up, then you can get to be a big hero because you go in and you do everything you can, and, if it doesn't work, well, it was God's will that everybody should die in the town or something. But this is crazy because it's not science. It's not what we know, and we can do better.
Well, let us
Maybe you should come to Ascania with us
sense
and talk about the train all night.
in course. thanks to Professor Brooks, and thanks you for your attention and coming. Thank you.